3 years, Ilani. 3 years, and the examination confirms what I always suspected. You are barren. You have failed this family. You will go to Ashvale House tonight. Leave the Federeth name with dignity, what little you have left of it.
The Duke came to finalize their divorce. He was shocked to see her pregnant Lady Cordelia at the top of the staircase, servants frozen along the walls, rain through the open door. Lady Cordelia. 3 years, Ilani. 3 years, and the examination confirms what I always suspected. You are barren. You have failed this family. You will go to Ashvale House tonight. Leave the Federeth name with dignity, what little you have left of it. Ilani says nothing. She pulls her cloak around herself and walks out into the rain. That was the night Lady Cordelia Federeth decided her daughter-in-law had served her purpose and outlived her welcome. She delivered that verdict in the entrance hall of Federeth Hall, loudly, deliberately, in front of every maid and footman within earshot, because humiliation was not a side effect of what she was doing. It was the point. She wanted witnesses. She wanted the story told a certain way before anyone thought to question it. What she did not want was questions about the examination. Mrs. Hilda Crane had arrived that afternoon with her black bag and her carefully arranged conclusions. She spent 40 minutes in Ilani's chamber. She left without meeting Ilani's eyes, the tell of someone who knows exactly what they have done and has decided the money makes it bearable. Her written verdict was already in Lady Cordelia's hands before the ink was dry. Confirmed barren, incapable of fulfilling the fundamental obligations of the marital contract. And Lady Cordelia had read it aloud in that entrance hall like a sentence. What nobody in that room knew was that the examination was a lie. And the woman she had just sent out into the November rain was carrying the Federeth heir. Stay with me, because in 7 months, Julian Federeth is going to walk through the doors of Ashvale House to finalize the divorce, and what he finds there is going to destroy everything his mother built. And before we go any further, if you have ever watched someone survive something that was designed to finish them, drop it in the comments right now, and hit that like button. It helps more people find this story. Julian was not home when it happened. That matters, because if he had been standing in that entrance hall, if he had watched his mother point toward the door, watched Ilani pull her cloak around herself, or watched her walk out into the rain without a single word, the story might have ended differently that night. He might have followed her. He might have asked questions. He might have chosen differently before months of engineered silence made the choosing so much harder. But Julian was away. A business journey to oversee the family's overseas holdings. 4 months, possibly longer, the kind of journey that requires correspondence rather than conversation, and leaves a household to run itself under whoever holds the authority. Lady Cordelia had held the authority at Federeth Hall for 31 years. She had not always been this way, or perhaps she had, and Julian had simply been too close to see it clearly. But the truth Ilani had understood within her first month of marriage and never quite found the words to say without sounding like a woman making accusations, was that Lady Cordelia Federeth could not bear to be second in her only son's life. Not second to an estate, not second to a duty, second to a wife. Julian had loved Ilani in the uncomplicated, unhesitating way of a man who has not yet learned to make love conditional. He had prioritized her comfort over his mother's preferences at dinner. He had taken her side in small disagreements with the easy confidence of a man who does not realize that every small victory his wife wins is being recorded somewhere, carefully, quietly, by someone who intends to collect eventually. Lady Cordelia had collected. 3 years of marriage without a child was the opening she needed. Not because the Federeth line required an heir urgently. Julian was 32 and healthy and there was time. But because barrenness was the one verdict that could not be argued with socially. It was clean. It was documented. It removed Ilani without a scandal and left the door open for a second marriage, this time to a family Lady Cordelia had already selected. A connection that would restore the political influence she felt the Federeth name had been quietly losing since Julian stopped taking her counsel as seriously as he once had. She had chosen the weapon carefully. She had simply needed someone to fire it. Mrs. Hilda Crane had debts. Lady Cordelia had liquidity. The arrangement had taken less than a week to conclude. Ashvale House sat 3 miles east of Federeth Hall, on land that had belonged to the family for generations and been quietly forgotten by most of them. It had been a dower house once, maintained properly, staffed adequately. That was before Lady Cordelia decided it was an unnecessary expense and reduced its staff to a skeleton, a housekeeper, a groundsman, a single kitchen maid. The rest had been let go, and the property left to the dignified neglect of a house nobody important was expected to use. Ailani arrived there on a November night with rain in her hair, mud on the hem of her ruined dress, and nothing else that mattered. Mrs. Edith Bradford met her at the door. Mrs. Bradford had been housekeeper at Ashvale House for 33 years, longer than Lady Cordelia's reign over the main hall, longer than Julian's memory of the place, long enough to have formed very firm opinions about the Federeth family that she kept entirely to herself with the discipline of a woman who understands that observed silence is its own form of power. She took one look at Ailani on the doorstep, soaked, composed, refusing to perform the collapse the evening had been specifically designed to produce, and stepped aside without a word to let her in. The East guest room was ready within the hour, fire lit, dry clothes sourced from somewhere, hot tea that appeared without being requested. Ailani sat at the narrow writing desk, with its single window facing the stables, and looked at the rain working at the glass, and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives when the worst thing finally happens and turns out not to have killed you, that she was going to be impossible to finish. She was 2 weeks pregnant. She did not know it yet, but the child already did. From the moment Julian's ship docked 4 months ago, Ailani had been writing to him. Not begging, not pleading. Writing. The way you write to someone you have built a life with and cannot explain their silence except by assuming the worst and refusing to accept it. She wrote every week, sometimes twice. She told him about Ashvale House, about Mrs. Bradford, about the cold east room in the garden she had started pulling briars from, because she could not bear to watch things die from neglect. She told him, carefully, in the letter she rewrote 4 times before she was satisfied, about the pregnancy, about the child that Mrs. Hilda Crane had somehow failed to detect despite examining her thoroughly, about what that meant for everything Lady Cordelia had arranged. She sent every letter to Federeth Hall addressed directly to Julian. Not one of them reached him. Julian had written 2. From the moment he returned from the overseas journey and found Ailani gone, found his mother waiting with documentation and a carefully constructed account, and the particular satisfaction of a woman who has managed a situation exactly as she intended. Something in him had resisted, not loudly, not decisively, but persistently, in the way of a man whose instincts are telling him something his circumstances are making it very convenient to ignore. He had written to Ailani at Ashvale House within a week of his return. He had written again a fortnight later when no reply came. He had written a 3rd time, shorter, more uncertain. The letter of a man beginning to believe the silence means something. And then Lady Cordelia had sat across from him at dinner and said with the measured sorrow of a woman delivering difficult news reluctantly, "She has not responded to your father's solicitor either, Julian. I think she has decided a clean break is kinder for everyone." He had set down his fork, said nothing, and told himself with the exhausted logic of a man who had been traveling for 4 months and come home to devastation that some silences were answers. Every letter Julian sent to Ashvale House was intercepted at Federeth Hall before it left the property. Every letter Ailani sent from Ashvale House was collected by a Federeth footman Lady Cordelia had specifically instructed and never forwarded. They sat in the rosewood cabinet in Lady Cordelia's study, bound in order by date with the neat efficiency of a woman who kept records of everything, including her own cruelties. On the outside of Ilani's bundle, in Lady Cordelia's own copperplate hand, a single label, A to J, not forwarded, written as casually as a household inventory note. The mundane organization of it more chilling than any dramatic label would have been. She did not hide what she had done. She filed it. That decision would cost her everything. Julian returned to a mother who was ready. She had the medical documentation. She had Mrs. Crane's written verdict. She had a carefully constructed account of Ilani's departure that emphasized dignity and discretion. She understood the situation, Julian. She left without a scene, and she had made sure no member of Federath Hall staff offered a different version of events. Julian asked questions. Lady Cordelia had answers for all of them. He asked to see the documentation. She produced it. He asked whether Ilani had said anything before she left. Lady Cordelia paused, the precise pause of someone performing reluctance, and said, "She seemed relieved. I think she had been carrying the weight of this knowledge for some time." Julian had stood at the foot of the grand staircase for a long time after that conversation. Something in him had known. Not the details, not the mechanics, but the shape of it. The feeling of a conclusion that had arrived too neatly. He had stood there with that wrongness and chosen, in the way of men who have been trusting one woman's judgment their entire lives, to call it grief rather than suspicion. The dissolution proceedings began within a fortnight. He told himself he was being practical. He told himself Ilani would be provided for. He told himself the silence coming back from Ashvale House confirmed that this was what Ilani wanted too. He did not go to Ashvale House. He did not ask her directly. He signed the papers his solicitor placed before him and told himself that was the responsible thing. That silence was the thing he would have to live with longest. If you can see exactly where this is heading, and your heart is already racing, like this video and comment, "Justice" below. Let's see how many of us are watching for the same moment. 7 months passed at Ashvale House in the way that difficult time passes, slowly at first, and then all at once. Ilani discovered the pregnancy 6 weeks after her arrival, confirmed by a local midwife in the village who had no connection to Lady Cordelia and no debt to settle. She sat with the information for 3 days before she decided what it meant. It meant she was not leaving. It meant she was not writing again. She had written enough, and the silence coming back from Federath Hall had told her everything she needed to know about where those letters were going. If Julian came to her, he would come on her terms, or not at all. It meant she was going to survive Ashvale House, and the winter and the isolation and the steady reduction of funds Lady Cordelia engineered through the solicitor with the efficiency of someone tidying an inconvenience. She sought out a second midwife in her 3rd month. Mrs. Caroline Hatch of Ipswich, recommended by the village doctor, unknown to Lady Cordelia, meticulous in her documentation. Mrs. Hatch examined her thoroughly, recorded her findings in full, and produced a sworn statement that Ilani locked in the writing desk drawer. She would need it eventually. She intended to be ready. The divorce summons arrived on a gray Tuesday in her 7th month. Cream envelope, black wax, the Federath Hawk seal, the same seal that had once meant safety. She read every line. Then she placed her hand on her belly and felt the child shift. Slow, unhurried, indifferent to what any legal document had to say about her existence. She refolded the summons along its crease. Outside, the first thunder of a November storm moved across the fields like a warning. He was already on the road. She would go down when she was ready. Not before. Don't go anywhere. Because what happens when Julian walks through that door is what this entire story has been building toward. The next few minutes will make everything worth it. The Federath carriage came through diagonal rain, the hawk crest gleaming cold on its door, 4 dark horses pulling fast against the wind. Julian stepped out, broader than memory, rain-soaked, with a wound on his left cheekbone still too raw to be anything but recent. A duel, she would learn later, fought a fortnight ago for reasons that had turned out to matter considerably less than he thought. Mrs. Bradford received him at the door of Ashfield House with the expression of a woman who has formed a complete opinion and will be keeping it entirely to herself. He entered the hall, stood before his grandfather's portrait, one of several Federeth pieces relocated to Ashvale House over the years, and composed himself the way men compose themselves before legal proceedings, with the deliberate suppression of everything that is not the task at hand. He was here to end a marriage, efficiently, without theater. Then he heard footsteps on the stairs. Ailani descended slowly, one hand on the banister, the other holding his summons folded in her fingers. Dark gray wool dress, the only one that still accommodated her. White lace at the collar and wrists, added herself, because she refused to appear diminished. Hair pinned clean and simple, face carrying the composure of someone who has rehearsed this in every version and is no longer afraid of any of them. He turned, and his face didn't change. It evacuated. In every composed, ducal, carefully maintained certainty, simply left it at once, and what remained underneath was raw and unguarded in a way Ailani suspected no one had been allowed to see in a very long time. His eyes moved from her face to the unmistakable curve beneath her dress. His lips parted. Nothing came out. "Your Grace," Ailani said, reaching the bottom step. "You look as though you've arrived with some expectations." She held the summons out between them like a mirror. The storm took the roads within the hour. Neither of them was leaving that night. Julian wanted answers immediately. Ailani gave them plainly. The examination staged, the verdict purchased, Mrs. Crane's debt settled by Lady Cordelia before the midwife ever entered her chamber. His first instinct was denial. And then the baby moved, a slow, visible ripple beneath the gray wool, unhurried, alive, indifferent to the legal dispute surrounding its existence. Julian stopped mid-sentence. Something cracked open in the silence that followed. "May I?" he began, and stopped, surprised by his own question. She did not say yes or no. She waited. He knelt before her chair and pressed his palm to the curve of her belly, with a reverence that visibly cost him something. Later, candles low, storm at the windows, he stood with his back to her and spoke to the glass, because he was not yet brave enough for her face. "I knew something had been arranged. I told myself it wasn't my place to question her judgment." "She is your mother," Ailani said. After a long moment she did not soften. "And I was your wife." He closed his eyes. She did not comfort him. But she did not leave, and in this story, that was everything. Julian believed her. He believed every word. But belief without proof would not be enough for a magistrate, and he knew it. He rode to Federeth Hall alone the following morning, 4 miles through the last of the storm, arriving at a house that was quiet in the particular way of a house whose mistress is out. Lady Cordelia had gone to a social engagement in the village. She had not expected her son. She had not expected anyone to go looking. He went directly to her study, to the rosewood cabinet her solicitor had mentioned months ago during the precautionary reorganization of documents following her heart episode. He had a key. He was the Duke. Every lock in every Federeth property answered to him, a fact Lady Cordelia had spent 31 years finding ways to work around. And the cabinet opened. Inside, Lady Cordelia's letters to Mrs. Hilda Crane in her own copperplate hand, payment confirmations, instructions specifying the examination be conducted with appropriate brevity so as not to invite dispute. The letter dated 3 days before Mrs. Crane ever entered Ailani's chamber, already describing her as confirmed barren. The verdict written 72 hours before any evidence was gathered. And underneath all of it, tied separately, bound by date, in 2 distinct bundles, something else entirely, his own letters, every one he had written to Ashvale House, unopened, his own handwriting on the outside, seals unbroken, and beside them, Ailani's letters to him, every one she had written, labeled on the outside in Lady Cordelia's own hand, A to J, not forwarded. He stood at that cabinet for a long time. He thought about the dinner where his mother had told him Ailani preferred a clean break. He thought about the 3 letters he had written into silence, and the silence he had decided to call an answer. He thought about 4 miles of road between this house and Ashvale House that he had not once traveled in 7 months. He took everything, every document, both bundles, all of it. He rode back to Ashvale House through thin winter light with the full weight of what his mother had done in a saddlebag against his side, and 4 miles of reckoning and nothing else to do with it but face it. He set everything on the drawing room table before Ailani without a word. She looked at the documents. She looked at the letter bundles. She looked at him. Then she picked up the bundle labeled in Lady Cordelia's hand and read those 4 words, A to J. Not forwarded, written with the casual efficiency of a household inventory, as though intercepting a wife's letters to her husband were simply a matter of domestic organization. She set it down, picked up the first of her own letters, the one she'd written in her 2nd week at Ashvale House, the one that had begun Julian, I do not know what you have been told, but I need you to hear this from me directly, and held it for a moment without opening it. She had already lived what was inside it. She had written every word. She knew exactly what it said. What she had not known, until this moment, was that he had never read it. She kept them, Ailani said quietly. All of them, Julian said. Mine and yours both. He reached into the bundle of his own letters and found the one she needed to see, the one he had written in the 3rd week after his return, when the silence from Ashvale House had begun to feel wrong in a way he could not name. He set it before her without comment. She read it. She read the part where he said he did not understand her silence, the part where he said he was asking her directly, bypassing the solicitor, bypassing everything, just her and him and the truth of what had happened. The part where he said he needed to hear from her in her own words before he could accept that this was what she wanted. The letter Lady Cordelia had filed neatly in a cabinet and never sent. Ailani set it down on the table beside her own unsent letters. She sat across from you at dinner, Ailani said, and told you I preferred a clean break. Yes, Julian said, while my letters were in that cabinet. Yes. The silence that followed was the longest in the story, and the most necessary. Send for Magistrate Hale, Ailani said. Today. It was the first time she had asked him for anything since he arrived. He was already moving before she finished the sentence. The following morning, Mrs. Bradford placed Mrs. Caroline Hatch's sworn statement on the breakfast table with the same expression she used when delivering the post. Unremarkable, unhurried, complete. Julian read it standing, set his cup down carefully when he reached the confirmation that Ailani had been approximately 2 weeks pregnant at the time of Mrs. Crane's examination. Lady Cordelia had known, or had every reason to know, and had sent her pregnant daughter-in-law into a November rainstorm with no resources and no acknowledgement that she was carrying the Federath heir. He did not speak for some time. When he did, he addressed Mrs. Bradford directly, with the voice of a man who has decided something that will cost him considerably, and has decided anyway. Make sure Magistrate Hale receives everything. The Crane letters, the payment records, both letter bundles, and Mrs. Hatch's statement, all of it on the table before she arrives. Mrs. Bradford collected the documents with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has been waiting 33 years for exactly this morning. Lady Cordelia arrived at Ashvale House expecting to manage a private family situation. She wore her best visiting dress. She had composed several gracious explanations in the carriage, each designed to restore proper order without conceding anything. She found instead a magistrate, a table covered in her own letters, her son at its head, and Ailani seated to his right. Not as a supplicant, not as the problem to be resolved, as someone who belonged at that table and had earned her place through 7 months of surviving everything this family had done to move her off it. Lady Cordelia's composure was extraordinary. It held through the first letter, the second, the payment records. It began to fracture during Mrs. Hatch's sworn testimony. It failed entirely when Julian laid the final Crane letter before the magistrate and said with a quietness more devastating than any raised voice, "She wrote this 3 days before the examination." The verdict was decided before Mrs. Crane entered my wife's chamber. I want that on record. Then he placed both letter bundles on the table. She intercepted our correspondence for months. My letters to my wife's letters to me, including the letter in which my wife informed me she was carrying my child. She labeled them in her own hand and filed them in her cabinet. I want that on record as well. Ailani spoke once. She knew I was carrying your grandchild and she sent me out in the rain. I want that on record too. Lady Cordelia reached for the table. The magistrate reached for his pen. The woman who had arranged everything left with nothing, not even the dignity of being argued with, just servants who studied the floor, a carriage waiting, and the sound of documents being finalized in the room she had just been escorted from. The hall settled into the silence of things finally said, and the air clearing afterward. Julian stood at a careful distance, the distance of a man who has finally understood that proximity must be offered and accepted rather than assumed, and asked one question. Will you let me become someone worthy of what I should have been from the beginning? Ailani was quiet long enough for the fire to settle in the grate. I will not return to be managed. I will not be a function or a vessel for this family's requirements. I will not carry silence to protect anyone from the consequences of their own choices. If we rebuild as equals, with truth spoken plainly, or we do not rebuild at all. Those, Julian said, are the only terms I would have the right to accept. The divorce papers remained on the desk. Neither of them touched them. Spring came to Ashvale House as though correcting a long and serious error. Windows open, blossom on the warm air. The sound of Ailani's voice rising from the kitchen where she had taken her afternoon tea with the housemaids every day since December, because she could no longer bear rooms that existed only for certain kinds of people. The mahogany cradle stood in the shared bedroom, built to dimensions Ailani specified, and Julian followed without amendment, because he had learned, slowly and at considerable cost to his habits, that following was sometimes the greater act. One morning she stood at the window in her final weeks, both hands resting on the curve of her belly, watching the walled garden come back to life below. Julian came in quietly. She knew his footsteps now the way you relearn someone you thought you had finished knowing. He folded his arms around her from behind, his hands settling over hers. Is she restless today? Always. Like her father. He laughed, low, genuinely surprised by it. The laugh of a man still occasionally startled to find himself here, in this warmth, having chosen his way back into it one deliberate day at a time. She turned in his arms and looked at the scar on his cheek. The duel, she said. Tell me properly. All of it. He did. No more rooms kept closed between them. When she asked whether he was afraid, of fatherhood, of failure, of repeating what he had watched, he answered without the armor he had worn for 32 years. Every morning, I am afraid of choosing convenience again when it costs someone I love. She placed her palm against his jaw, the scar beneath her thumb. You are not your mother. You chose differently. That is not a small thing. Begin there, and begin again tomorrow, and the day after. The child moved, decisive, emphatic, entirely certain of her place in the world. The Federeth line continued, not as Lady Cordelia had designed it, built on erasure and the management of love as though it were an estate liability, but as something neither of them had a map for, chosen, imperfect, difficult, and in every way that matters, real. If this story moved you, the night she walked into the rain without a single word, the moment Julian opened that cabinet and found every letter filed in his mother's handwriting, the part where Ailani reads the letter he sent, asking for the truth that was sitting in a cabinet 3 miles away, the part where she says, "I was your wife," and does not soften it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that surviving is not the same as being finished. Comment Ailani below if you were rooting for her from the very first scene. And if you are not subscribed yet, subscribe now. I break down stories like this every single week, and I am just getting started.